Firstly, let me introduce our host to this event, Dr. Jennifer Pierce. Jennifer is the host of Singular XQ, the podcast about digital transformation, as well as the founder of the nonprofit of the same name. Singular XQ is committed to working to support social and cultural digital transformation through education, research, and development. Next up, we have our guest for this event, Dr. Kat Hicks. Kat is the VP of Research Insights and head of the Developer Success Lab for Pluralsight Flow. She is a scientist who spends her time researching developers, and from my side is one of the most fascinating voices in the developer experience narrative. I'm really happy that we managed to set this event up. It's such an important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jen to take it away.
Thanks, Giles. I'm super happy to be here and that you invited, because I agree. Kat, do you want me to call you Dr. Kat or Kat?
Kat is completely fine. I do enjoy the Dr. Kat. My mom and I got our PhDs around the same time. And so I called her Dr. Mom and she called me Dr. Kat for about a year. So I am fond of it.
Love that story. That's another story we'll have to talk about sometime. So yes, Kat is very interesting, and I can't wait to dig into this subject with her. So tell me a little bit about how you came upon the topic of belonging. And what was your goal with that research agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a social scientist. I did my PhD in psychology. And I've always been really, really interested in what we call like applied social science. So you're out there in the real world. I actually call myself an action researcher. So this is a term we like to use to describe sort of a value alignment with your research, where you say, you know, my science only matters as long as it gets out there and helps people. I would say, you know, there's always many, many reasons we come to our research topics, right? Like it's maybe things we've experienced. It's also, of course, what other scientists have told us is important, because it can't just all come out of your own head, as much as you might like that. And both of those things are true for me for belonging. I started in educational research, actually, spent a lot of time in classrooms. And so I got trained to really think about interventions. So like, how do we try to make the biggest difference for the largest number of people, or for like a very important group of people in some cases? And how do we try to make that difference with, you know, sort of the smallest amount of time or the smallest amount of resources? So belonging is one of those concepts in research that we've seen really powerful impact from. So belonging is a very, you know, common word. It's one that you probably have used in your own vocabulary, right? But for scientists, you can imagine like belonging is sort of the answer to the question. You look around yourself wherever you are and you ask, do I belong here? Our answer to that question is something that psychologists like to call sense of belonging. So we've actually defined this as a research thing that we can measure, a concept that we can measure pretty consistently in different environments. I was super interested in what that looked like on technology teams. So that's where my work here started.
That's really interesting, because the measurability of it is something that I think people question, right? And
Sure.
other terminologies that I won't introduce here are sometimes, you know, questioned for that. Like, how do you measure these different indexes of diversity? So what did you find about belonging? What are those measurable aspects that you looked at? And then
Yeah.
how that applies to developers specifically.
I'd love to dive deeper into the measurement question, because, you know, it's music to my ears. Like whenever people are like, can you really measure this? I have to say, I always say, yeah, good instinct, right? Like we should question our huge, complicated, amazing human experience. We will never perfectly measure it. All measures are imperfect, all measures are flawed, including how we measure minutes on the clock, and, you know, how we measure distances and how we measure the weather. So psychology deals with that as well. Just like if you are trying to look through the atmosphere where there's a lot of clouds and like see the stars, we are trying to kind of look at complicated human experience in a way that's useful enough for us to make some good decisions moving forward. So our way of trying to do that we've used some empirically validated survey measures around belonging. So if you ask people a bunch of different items, a bunch of different questions about their environment, you can start to get at what we call the latent factor, like the factor behind the questions that tends to be driving them. We never think we've measured this perfectly, right? But we do think we get a really important signal to move forward on. In our lab, in the Dev Success Lab, we have crafted some belonging measures for software teams specifically. So we ask, do you feel like you belong as a developer? Do you feel like you belong on your software team? Do you feel like you belong in this kind of engineering work? There's a lot of different places you can ask about belonging. And this actually, to me, is very important and exciting because that means we kind of carry around different senses of belonging in different environments or different situations. That can make it much more complicated, but it also means it's a place where we have some movement to play with as scientists. We can look at what are the good situations and the bad situations, and what can we learn to make those bad ones better. So really quickly, what we found, we have measured belonging along with a number of other constructs, but we've measured belonging on software teams. We find it statistically significantly predicts how productive those developers tell us they are able to be. This includes, all kinds of other things we might care about. So we accounted for experience, we looked at it across different industries, we looked at it across different types of engineering work. And this sense of belonging is really predictive. It's also predictive in our research of team effectiveness, which is different from individual productivity, right? And I know I just opened a can of worms by saying productivity, but we do use some really helpful, interesting measures of how productive people feel like they are able to be inside of their workplaces. So I like to lead with that point because I think people often think, well, belonging's a nice to have, it makes me feel better, like it's just good for my mental health, right? I want to make the point right out the gate, belonging connects quite directly to the amount of work people feel like they're able to get done and the quality of that work. We see that in our research.
I can't resist. I got to go into that one little thing you kind of smiled about, but productivity. What are those ways that I know how we measure it in software, and it's a little bit of a controversial subject, as you sort of indicated. How did you measure productivity specifically?
In our research of the last year, we have relied on self-report measures of productivity. So that means we run a really, really big survey with a bunch of people and we say, I want you to reflect on the last month that you had. So we keep it close in time because people are way better at answering that. And we say, you tell me how productive you think you were able to be. And we look at it at scale. So we don't think that this question is the be all end all of the way you can measure productivity. But it has been kind of the gold standard in developer experience research to start with a self-report measure like this. We found that this item, we actually put some work into developing like a good survey item. It has good reliability across different people. That's something we want to check for. So it's a starting place. I will give you all, because I can't resist doing this, like a little sneak peek into upcoming research from the Dev Success Lab. So in 2024, we're moving into some really exciting work. We have done a workshop study with developers, and we've actually asked them to bring us along kind of with them in their daily lives, looking at things like how quickly are you able to get through code reviews? How good do you think those code reviews were? So getting into some really specific work tasks. That's a different kind of measure of productivity, and we see some really interesting connections there as well. So more to come on this.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to read that. And I'm wondering, when you read out these results, to management, to people who have to manage and sort of make developer productivity into dollars. So how do they receive these results, and I'm most interested in where is there friction? Where does it not land well? And what have you developed to sort of finesse those results?
Yeah. So, That's a really big question. I'm going to take like a little beat because I love to give myself time to think about big questions. I find a couple different things happen. You know, we actually have found just a huge amount of resonance with software teams on this topic. So I think it might be kind of tempting to say our technology leaders are not going to get this. They're not going to care. We've struggled with diversity in this field. That is true. Like I see and feel the pain around these topics for software teams. So while fully validating this, I also have seen almost like a sense of relief, honestly, when we present these kinds of findings. And when we present this and we say, you know how you've always kind of seen that the culture of your team actually really matters to the kind of code you write? You know how you've always believed that that really should be protected? Well, we have scientific evidence about it that confirms your lived experience.
Yes.
So yeah, my lab starts from that perspective. It's not really like telling people what to think as much as it's trying to say, you have evidence on your side, right? I will say people have shared a lot of, I have a really scary meeting coming up with my leadership where I want to make the point that, our culture is bad and we need to fix it. So to go right to like, I mean, people listening might have these moments. I don't have a single answer for that. It's not like a single solution kind of thing. However, some recommendations I would give are, bring external evidence so it feels a little less personal. You don't have to like hinge everything on sharing your own, personal experience with belonging. So that's one of the reasons we produce public research that we try to put in the hands of people so it doesn't feel like it's coming from their orgs. It can be less threatening for leaders if it's a little bit more like the language of science, y'all, and one thing
And
I've
generalized,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. One thing I've seen too is there's actually a lot of research on this outside of software engineering. And that can feel, I know software engineers always want research about themselves. Like that's what I'm here for. But it can be very powerful and almost like a mental break, for leaders, almost a little creative to say, hey, did you know this stuff has been measured in a large RCT across like 22,000 different undergrads, including large engineering programs, and sort of diversify some of the sources of evidence that you're showing to people. That's been really helpful.
So that's really interesting, and I'm gonna file that away because I do a lot of this, like reading out to C-suite members, not necessarily people with developer experience themselves. So I'm going to return to that on a personal note. But I want to ask you about gender or people who self-identify as female. Are there specific findings that you can share here that sort of illuminate this well-documented fact of poor representation of female identifying people on software
Yeah,
teams?
absolutely. So there are women, people who, identify in that way. This is not to say it doesn't show up for many different groups, but the focus of our, topic here, women do report lower sense of belonging across the board. They report it across the board in a number of different STEM fields, and really quite specifically in computer science. That's probably not a big surprise, right? Like this is sort of the mechanism that we think, one of the mechanisms that's behind a lot of the diversity gaps that we see. And it starts early. It starts really early in the beliefs that students carry around with them in school. It also, I want to make this point, we're all probably pretty familiar with the sort of irritation of like, okay, don't tell me everything is just imposter syndrome. Like it's my fault that not confident enough or something like this. One of the things that science has shown us about women in STEM fields is that women are very accurate about the fact that other people will evaluate them more harshly. And really, this applies to many different groups as well. But women is a really interesting group for science to learn about, in part because there are so many women in the world. And so we can look at people with this identity in so many different cases. So it's a very telling signal for us. And I think that, one of the things that is really interesting about women's experience here is the complexity of it, like across the career stages too. So, one thing that maybe 20 years ago in science, we were a little bit like, okay, sense of belonging really matters. Like, let's, try to make spaces like more gender neutral or gosh, like create a pink wrench or something ridiculous, right? Like those kinds of shallow surface signals of belonging, those haven't really stuck. But what has really stuck and been effective, particularly in increasing the number of women in engineering programs, is, these interventions that help women develop allyship, resilience, and sort of find ways for them to find that sense of belonging even before we fix the whole culture of the whole group. So that's been a very cool finding. One thing that a study that we cite all the time in our lab found was that there was an engineering department that did this, that invested in a belonging intervention. And then they also found that it actually lifted the student experience for everybody. Like it used to be that all of the male engineering students in this department struggled to make friends and struggled to like have social connections and were actually really feeling the effects of a very toxic kind of competition culture as well. And then when they invested in this belonging intervention for the women in this program, those women went out and improved the culture for everyone as well. So that was like a really beautiful story here.
Speaking of allyship, Giles, you're the one who set up this whole topic of conversation. What are the questions that you have, or the complexities that you've had in trying to be an ally for female identifying representation on your software teams?
I think Kat kind of raised the point is the it's very difficult to find women. I think that a lot of the damage has been done earlier, right? So when I'm hiring, I'm kind of doing my best to kind of create as diverse a team as I possibly can, right? And I tend to focus on diversity of thought as much as possible. But I think what's fascinating for me is I definitely feel that there are definitely engineering teams that I've worked in that have been incredibly masculine, and I haven't felt like I belong, right? Like I haven't felt like, I felt I'm gonna think twice before I ask that question. I'm gonna think twice before. And I think, we're talking about women here, but actually there are so many other kind of areas that are improved by kind of creating a space where even one other group of people belong. Then you've kind of broken a wall down, right? And that suddenly people are thinking, oh well, if one other group of people, if two groups of people belong, then maybe a third group of people and a fourth, and suddenly we're thinking very differently about the teams and the organizations and the culture that we're creating. And that's why I thought it was really important. But very much I'm here to learn as well. And so I'm sure I've kind of stuck my foot in it as I've spoken.
I'd like to hit that back to Kat, because you hit on like at least three things that I'd like to, but one thing I would like to idea that female software developers are hard to find. So what do you think about that? Did you find anything? Like one thing that I've heard, and maybe you can comment on this, Kat, if the science lines up, is that sometimes that's because the system itself is sending signals that you aren't welcome, so they don't show up.
For sure. Yeah. So let me let's put some teeth in it. I mean, Giles, you like very humbly we're like, I'm here to learn. I hate it when people say I can't solve the problem of gender equity because we can't hire enough women. This is a massively global field with millions of people in it. And estimates on this are a little bit complicated, but here's an example. I think that many large engineering orgs are around 20 to 30% female at this point. Depends on what you do, depends on the area. There's all kinds of like within the organization parts of this. It's not, to me, just about challenging the pipeline and fixing the pipeline. That is a thing that we need to get on. But there are women around us all right now, right, who need to be seen equitably. And so there are women maybe who've considered learning to code, who are on a product team right now, who are not feeling invited into the technology work that they are actually even tasked with in their jobs. So as we think about the technology workforces of the future, you know, we have a desperate need for developers. We've really been failing to get this right. And I think it intersects with so many things. It intersects with how we thought we could just rely on hiring a bunch of graduates from the same program and that would be fine. You know, that was never a good strategy anyway. And it completely cuts us off from seeing the brilliance, you know, in the world from so many people who are systematically left out of those pipelines. So I think what's hopeful and uplifting about this rather than overwhelming is you can actually think about ways to get towards this solution in from so many different vantage points, from the place where you have, again, you know, biggest lever, you know, smallest investment, biggest impact, like as someone I think in the chat said, very engineering mindset to this, right? Is it advocating for more learning time inside of your engineering organization? That tends to be something that's really beneficial for working moms, for example. Is it making sure that a diversity audit across your org actually includes a software engineer? Because they often don't, right? Like they often don't say, what's a technical, really like technical perspective on diversity needs here? Um, you know, another thing I can think of that I've heard people do is advocate for an audit around access and tool adoption. This may seem very like, I don't know, like even like in some of the rising DevOps work that we see orgs do, I think you find these system-minded people who can become large advocates for culture if they get into the right rooms, right? And if they sort of understand how to unlock things for people. I find that very intriguing here, like a very almost like a superpower of engineers, right? So I'm rambling a little bit, sorry, Jennifer, but something that we saw in our research is women on software teams are more likely to say, everyone else on my team has access to X tool, X new shiny tool. I got left out of that access actually, and you know, I don't want to be a problem solving, you know, raising person. I don't want to be a troublemaker. Like there's all kinds of social reasons that this might be happening. So imagine like extending some of our work on tools, developer experience to really explicitly center like gender inclusion. I think that would be awesome.
You just triggered a whole bunch of memories I have of Christmas and what the boys got and what I got. And yeah,
Right?
so, but let me ask, coming back to Giles' point, which he said something pretty profound there about his sense of belonging. I'm wondering with intersectionality, there are a lot, identifying as male is not like a homogenized group, right? There's all sorts of other intersectional identities that male identifying people can have. So do you find that teams that have lower representation of female identifying engineers have other low indices of belonging that don't have to do with gender? And if not, maybe that's,
Yeah. We haven't measured that directly. Like
yeah.
great research question. Yeah, I would love to explore it. I would say my knowledge of the larger science around this is that there's been a lot of evidence, you know, that the practices that create inclusion for people are the same psychological practices that create like long-term sustainable good work. So sometimes it comes at some short-term cost. So you have to be careful how you look at this. For example, you know, you see this a lot in software engineering, a team that's like, we're really comfortable with who we are and we love how we all communicate. And gosh, suddenly having to work globally with people of a different culture is creating a lot of new things for us to think about. If you have a sense of developer experience that is just like very individual and that's like, well, I have to do everything I can to keep developers from ever being distracted because they're just pure, you know, minds, they're just brains in jars is something I like to say, you know, and so we, you know, all of this other stuff would be nice to solve, but actually like, it's a distraction. You know, you're cutting yourself off from the path to the innovation that we need in this industry. And I think that other people's research, you know, other than mine, has found that pretty reliably when you measure it at like a large enough time course. I think that, you know, it is important to acknowledge that while we're very excited about the like rising tide lifts all boats, I don't want to claim that the things that women need and the historical things that women have experienced in software is exactly the same as what everyone else needs and all these other important, you know, group needs. So we see some differences in our research. For instance, we see that belonging matters for everybody, but the ways that people are cut out of processes or the ways that they're judged unfairly, those might differ a lot. So there's a lot to learn there. So we recently did a project where we looked at Gen AI on software teams, Gen AI, excuse me, Gen AI on software teams. That's a mouthful. And we found that women there were some emerging, you know, gender equity gaps along tool access. But there were very different patterns that we saw for minoritized developers or developers of the global majority, is one way you might put it. And one thing that was really interesting is, you know, women seemed very cut out of like learning and upskilling in AI. That is not the case for minoritized developers who perhaps have like a very, very large strength here of like really leaning in, you know, to, you know, maybe even assuming they have to self-teach themselves things. That's actually a strength from this group that we saw, like a lot of self-efficacy to learn new skills. So, you know, it's important to not just muddle all of these groups together and say we're going to learn the same thing from each one.
Yeah, very, very important to keep in mind. Giles, how are we doing on time? I had a question. I just wanted to follow up on that, but maybe we
We've
want to
got
turn it over
plenty
to
of
the.
time. Yeah, no,
Okay.
fill your boots.
So here would be my question about that precisely, which is if we find that belonging, well, let me back up. I've read some other research that I'd like you to respond to, and if you haven't done deep research in that area, you know, that's fair enough. But your impression that one of the things that's coming up, whether culturally determined or biologically determined, ethics is something that women there's an expectation that they're going to have a stronger hold on ethics. And speaking up on ethics, it also combines with their inability to self-advocate or advocate for others effectively if they were not female identifying, let's say. So I'm wondering if ethics comes into any of this, and if you know, there's a pretty high profile case where I've wondered where two females spoke up pretty vocally and then were removed and then were replaced by males, and the board became an all male board. I was just wondering, to what degree was it that the cultural expectation that the females would be a steward of that puts them in a position of targeted more frequently?
Oh, yeah. Well, you're a real causal inference thinker, you know, there's like so many different elements to this. I'm gonna pick out the pieces where I think I have like a science-backed opinion, because I'm not an ethics, you know, professor, right? However, I think that this is such a fascinating question. So I know that we tend to believe women should be responsible for more care work, right? Women should be kind of stewards of other people's behaviors, but not necessarily themselves be the like origin of genius. We have a lot of stereotypes about what women's work is. And unfortunately, those stereotypes, which you might think about playing out mostly, you know, in the household or like with parenting, right? It's like very easy to recognize those, at least in my country. You know, those actually really transfer to our workplaces. So you see the classic things like, well, women are supposed to do the notes, right? Like that kind of comes from this belief that women should be caretaking and maybe they're naturally good at that. And I think it's so dangerous to decide something is biological. I'm married to a biologist. So, you know, the answer to is something biological for us
Yeah.
in this household is always like, well, there's
I
a
kind of
million
sidestepped that. I was like cultural, biological, whatever it is.
What biology, yeah, like there's such a beautiful diversity in the world of where things come from, and all things are multivariate. But in something relevant to this audience, I think, you know, is that we tend to see, you know, that because of maybe the way women are socialized, right? They also can have this ability to recognize the importance of communication, collaboration, you know, social, you know, aspects of the work. I think that that work is not necessarily something that like women are inherently better at, but because of all the cultures around us, we might get more practice in it. We might become more responsible for it. And I think that's kind of dangerous. Like it kind of cuts men out, right, from being their full selves, and it puts this burden on women, which can show up in so many ways. Like you hear about the glass cliff phenomenon, you
I'm
know,
thinking about that's been in the news lately for
supposed
those
to
high
fix the
profile
failing.
placements, right? Yeah, there's been a CEO placement
Yeah.
recently. Yeah.
I think that it shows up in software work, it shows up in, you know, glue work, it shows up in, there's also just maybe the way that you, because of your identity, might become a person who just knows more other people of your identity, right? And then suddenly you're like this keeper of the knowledge about what's happening for this group in your company. And that's one reason I believe very strongly that technical leadership needs to take responsibility for being more involved with ergs, you know, with employee resource groups, and not just see these kinds of things as like an HR thing over there that has nothing to do with our engineering org, right? So a lot
Mm-hmm.
of different threads there, but
Yeah, that cultural expectation of particular roles is really what I was getting at, and along those lines too, like who is empowered to speak vertically and who's empowered to speak horizontally, and so you know, and speaking up into the vertical is very challenging, and
Mhm.
there is not representation there. Yes, and who? Yes, and so I'm wondering, have you noticed any difference in management structures? Because I'm not surprised to find out that developers are managers who are very close to the work are relieved to hear this work. But is there any correlation between management structures and representation in those management structures and the degree of belonging that an open-minded manager at the scrum level or you know even program level are able to enact?
Tell me a little bit more of like, what do you mean by management structures? Like help me to understand
Well,
that.
like you know, whoever's in the management structure above where the work is being done, where you
Ah,
have, you know, and so who people are reporting up into, right? And so not
yeah.
necessarily with even engineering experience, because I know that's a friction that probably, no matter how you identify, engineering communities share when increasingly they're put into structures where they might have to report to people who don't understand engineering experience because they don't understand
Mm,
the the field, right?
mm.
So is there a correlation there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, role models matter for one thing. So there's certainly this effect that can happen where there are people in leadership who look like you. And that by itself, even if they're not perfect people or kind of in no way different than the other leaders, even if they're not amazing, although they often are amazing, you know, that alone is actually very beneficial for people to see. Because remember, like belonging is this question we're asking ourselves, like, do I belong? Do I belong? And in psychology, we think we're constantly kind of reinventing the answer to that question. And so the more you have some good signals coming in, like I do belong, right? It can help you overcome, you know, these really bad moments, including moments of bigotry, moments of discrimination. Software research has found that, for instance, you know, women and minoritized developers face significantly more code pushback. This was work that came out of some researchers at Google. So code review pushback is like, it's just unnecessarily critical. You know, you might call it nitpicky, like really, you know, kind of axe to grind in how a code review is done. This is happening systematically more for people who are minoritized in software teams. So we know that there are these constant kind of sources of friction people are experiencing, we can try again, intervention, thinking, try to make your code review processes better, but also you want to come at everything with as many solutions as you can. So other recommendations we give include like, trying to make sure if you're in leadership that visibility in engineering work, visibility in what's celebrated, you're considering whether there's an equity problem, whether, and it can be very complex in software engineering, right? Because you can say, oh, we're doing pretty great. Actually, we have a lot of female leaders at this organization. But I'm sure, as a technical person, you think about this like, well, if I'm looking out there and I'm seeing that the only people who make architecture decisions, none of them look like me, or the only people who like, right? I see Giles nodding. So that's why I think some of these cross, organizational within the like organization questions are really important. We haven't directly measured, again, we haven't directly measured like inside of a company, the presence or absence of, a woman in leadership, like what does that do for the company? However, other people have asked this question quite a bit, and they find a lot of the time it ties to better financial performance. There were some interesting findings I saw in research that said, hey, there's better decision making happens when your decision making group is more diverse because people have been socialized to do different things. And so again, it's like what we're cutting ourselves off from when we are homogenous, is all kinds of diversity around how do we imagine things? Do we take turns in conversations? Do we like ideate more? Those are all strengths that female leaders have had in the business research.
Giles, why are you nodding so hard? Tell us what's going on in your head.
I think it just talks to my experience and more the antithesis of what Kat's describing talks to my experience of like when it is kind of, I mean, not even just male, but kind of quite tight kind of groups of men, all running an organization, then that's where kind of toxicity comes from. And so, I think I 100% agree with what Kat's saying, basically.
Yeah. Belonging to me,
Mm.
I saw like a shot from a TV show, Aging Myself in the 70s was very popular. And there was a very prominent African-American character. It was Little House on the Prairie, to confess. So you know what kind of childhood I had. But I saw it and I was actually moved because there was an African-American woman greeting the character on there. And I just thought representation matters. That phrase really resonated with me, that child seeing that person on that show allowed her to enter it and identify with it. So if you don't see somebody in the management level, you feel like there's that unconscious signal that you don't belong here because there's no career advancement potential for you here. So you might even unconsciously feel like you're threatened, right? Let me ask you, are there any other indicators that you've noticed that outside of the gender question at all, what kinds of cultural hallmarks are there of an organization that develops belonging?
I'll tell you a quote directly from a developer in our research.
Sure.
Somebody said, I feel safe when ideas and contributions are valued equally, whether it comes from someone who's been at the company for 15 years or it's some intern that just started. I focused a lot of my scientific career on this idea of learning cultures. And why is it so beautiful and so amazing and uplifting? It can last for years and years in your life when we find ourselves inside of a community of people that really values our learning. And I think it's because it's a fundamental mindset difference. It's an atmosphere of valuing long-term sustainable patterns, and that will be true on these tough topics of diversity, these places where we're struggling. um I think that a hallmark of belonging that we see are developers thinking locally. We can get so caught up in, my goodness, this world is a garbage fire sometimes. And think local. Like we see these people who've really changed things for the person next to them today or tomorrow, small actionable steps that celebrate and affirm someone, you know? And so I've seen that look like these developers practice asking their colleagues questions about why they did something a certain way. They ask themselves, even if I came up in this dog eat dog sort of training or what we call a contest culture, where everything I learned was that to be a technical superstar I had to be mean, I'm going to find a different way to be a technical superstar here. And we see those people bring curiosity and respect to technical dialogue. And suddenly it's like everything gets exploded. Why did we ever decide we needed to have this kind of interviewing? Why did we ever decide we were always going to recruit from this one school, even though this one school has like terrible diversity metrics in their students? You know, why have we not gotten creative with this? Like, we're engineers. Why have we not centered, you know, inclusivity engineering? You see those sorts of ways of thinking happen, I think, from these small, local, actionable steps.
The horizontal, yeah. When you can't control the vertical, you've got the horizontal. Hey, Giles, it sounds like you have a bunch of questions from the chat. So
Mhm.
Yeah, if we're ready, I think we've got 15 minutes left. I think now's a good time to start chatting questions. So we've got one from Hazel. So there's a lot of commentary on how to get started on fixing this, but what happens when you get over that initial hurdle? There seems to be a massive gap between not even acknowledging the problem and we've figured it out. How do you navigate that? That's actually something that kind of dials into my own experience at the minute. So I'd be interested to know what the answer is.
I'm curious if you could give me a little more specificity, like about this sort of situation. It's okay if not, I can riff, but
Hazel, do you want to jump
One
in?
second. I switched my cameras around. There we
No.
go. Yeah, so with this question, when you initially start, it can be sort of, okay, step one is actually listening to people. And the cool one, when you start listening to them, that's already so much further than most tech companies are. It's actually kind of insulting that the first step is literally just even acknowledging that people exist. But once you do that, it seems like there's this, like, oasis of an end state and this very, very large gap between we've started to acknowledge that these people exist and we have this, end state in mind of an actually equitable environment. And I'm reminded of one company that I actually used to work at that was very much modeled after a teal organization in the Reinventing Organizations book. Very huge on collaboration, very huge on positivity, working together, equity. They had basically everything right, but they had still remaining lingering problems with female representation. And they had some of these very, very small things that on paper everything was working and the organization wanted to improve, but they had somehow halted progress.
I would say, you know, very quick take, right? But because intermediate problems always require you to get more and more specific and like consultative, right? But, you know, I would challenge organizations who have taken that first step and are like, everyone's on board. You know, we've done that hard work, but we're remarkably, you know, hit that low bar. You know, I would challenge you to get much more specific about the outcomes that you want and the goals that you have, because it's amazing to me that we can create these incredible technological plans. And then when we set a target to improve things in the culture, we're just kind of like, and belonging will get better, like, you know. And that could be an okay like guiding light when you're first starting out, like maybe, but it's sort of staying on the like annual survey level of the problem. And surely we need to make progress faster than that. Like people's daily lives are happening, not on the annual HR survey cadence, right? So one recommendation that I see make a big difference for people to get them empowered is to start to get more specific. well, okay, again, hiring pipeline is one part of the problem, but I think we spend so much time talking about it that I want to talk about other parts. So an immediate medium-term goal for an org around belonging might be, are our code review processes really, really equitable? Are our retrospective processes or whatever we use to talk about who sets the narrative for how a decision happened, is that really equitable along gender lines? If we, want to be a place that women really want to work, like what do we need to learn and truly bravely learn, about the experience of women at this company right now? And I would always center fixing that first. I think that a lot of hiring policy changes can kind of organically, naturally start to come out of those looking inward changes, because you'll start to see people say, wow, we took a good hard look at what was really driving our best engineering work. And we were underappreciating like senior engineers who do a lot of mentorship. And it turns out that really, the system-minded people, we weren't really recognizing that. And then we decided we did want to recognize it. And then we were like, of course, we're not really hiring for this skill set, or we're not really valuing it in how we measure people in our hiring process. So I've seen it kind of go in that direction. So that's one place to start with that.
Great question, Hazel. Thank you.
So I've noticed Hazel's asked another question. I'm gonna put you on pause just to let some more questions come through, but we might come back to that. So Kim's asked a question: if you're already the odd one out on a team, it feels like paying more attention to whether people get left out marks you more as the outsider. Are there productive ways to navigate that, either by changing internal feelings or changing external behaviors?
Yeah.
It's a
Great
hard question.
question. Great question. And that's more, just if I might add to that, it's more about what are you assigned to do as that person inside the team? What other secondary functions are you performing? Right? If you're there to be the communicator and the consensus builder, does that target you?
I don't think that if you're navigating this on a personal level, your next step should be, I'm going to fix it for this team. I would as a social scientist, as a psychologist, I'm not a clinician, although I'm lucky enough to work next to one. Like the answer to me is not that suddenly you should be the person who designs the whole solution for this. So my very, very personally felt advice is the most productive way to first navigate these feelings is find support for yourself. And really center that, radically center that. I think that if you're already the odd one out on a team, you're already facing a high burden, of just navigating that, of getting, to a place where you feel your own sense of belonging. So some science-backed recommendations, right? Like things that we see help individuals in this. Go outside of your immediate team, and find and create community. I know that this is more effort. It's not fair that we have to do this sometimes, but it can be very restorative and helpful. And this doesn't mean you have to be a social butterfly or something like that, but I think it does mean, I think it's very important. We see this for women in software, that you have this sense of your professional identity as a developer, that it's sustained by more than your immediate peers, that it's sustained by a connection to a larger community. And that doesn't mean you doing a lot of work. It means you finding places that nurture you, right? Or the fun and the joy of engineering, like a lot of the service work, which I applaud you if you do want to take it on, but a lot of the service work can drain you away from the intellectual joy. So that's my first sort of science-backed strategy. We're going to put out more work about navigating anxiety on software teams. We have some work on what it means to center thriving. I know Giles is going to send a link to our site where we've put out some things like interviews with developers about how they try to find thriving inside of their own careers. So some more stuff there for you.
Next question from Yanina. Do you have any recommendations for reading or watching or listening on this topic in the open source environment or community?
I don't have a lot myself. I have heard of, is it stories of open source? Like, I always feel like, you know, kind of getting, I mean, you would know this, Yanini, like the community side of these things and where people are talking online can be a really great source of, you know, learning from people's real experiences. But on like gender and open source, that I haven't, you know, I need to learn more myself, honestly. Very interested in like that community. It's come up a lot. People talk to us a lot about the unique burdens of that. You know, our lab works in an open science model ourselves, so sometimes we feel like the pressures of working in public, and feel that. So I am afraid I don't have a specific recommendation coming to mind, but if I think of one later today, I'll post it.
That's a great question. I'm going to find out some answers too.
Yeah.
A new message, 1 second. Okay. So let's go back. Hazel had a question. What do you think is the rough balance between top-down and bottom-up patterns of making change? How does one identify and correct things when you're heavy in one direction and that's presenting a full cultural organizational change from really manifesting? So I can assume, at least from my own experience, that that's heavy bottom up, and kind of hitting a wall, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, I'm just again giving myself a beat. Like,
It's not a small question.
yeah. No. You know, it depends on the change. So I'm a huge believer in bottom up change. Like, I mean, I'm always our center in the Developer Success Lab is on IC developers because
Yeah.
we're kind of like get closest to the work, get closest to the most direct experience, and then work out from there how to communicate and advocate. However, you know, a question that always comes up immediately is like, how do I convince my leadership? Or being a leader myself, I think constantly about the psychology of, you know, trying to be a human being here and have a certain amount of power and share and like actually take in feedback from, you know, your people and do that well. I think that, you know, a lot of I think that the work of identifying if you're heavy in one direction is pretty easy. Like, people kind of immediately know. I think that this is one thing where people there's a lack of courage sometimes in admitting like that there's a huge gap between, you know, leadership and ICs, let's say. So in our research, an example I love to use that you may have seen before, Hazel, is like I say, hey, if when we ask engineering managers, and this includes leaders, so people who are managers of managers, we ask them, do you think that you have enough visibility right into your engineering team's work? They across the board say absolutely. This is a super important part of my job and I do it. And you ask the ICs and they do not agree, right? This is a massive misalignment. And other people's software research, I think Margaret Ann Story is one researcher who's found that managers and ICs, even on the same team, can define success very differently, and they never maybe have talked about it. Fun fact, you know, one of the reasons we call the lab the Developer Success Lab, there was an early moment at a conference before we had named the lab. Carol and I went to the Strange Loop conference in St. Louis, and she was sitting at a table. Dr. Carol Lee is on my team. She's sitting at a table with an engineering manager who was there with their IC. And he said to her, you know, why are you a psychologist at a tech conference? Like, that's kind of unusual. People always ask us, like, what are you doing here? You know, what's the deal? And she was saying, oh, well, we're very interested in, you know, like how do developers understand themselves? And what do they think is success? And what do they think is, and the manager and the IC looked at each other and they said, oh, what do you think success is? You know, like they never had that conversation so
Right.
explicitly, right? So it's a bit of a ramble. I guess I don't have a tight answer for this one, but I think that, you know, this failure to even try to have a conversation is maybe one first thing that's preventing cultural organizational change. Like a lot of people might say we all want change, but we're not willing to talk about it with each other or really commit to it. Yeah, my recommendations usually start with like surfacing the conversation.
I think that aligns with one of our alumni of this event, Dave Snowden, who was very much around like, let's map the environment, let's kind of create a like an objective kind of visual of what reality is like, and only once we all agree on what reality is like, even if it's not, you know, strictly true, then we can start to have the conversation.
Yeah.
But at the moment, different people's reality is different things, and unless we come in and start discussing that, like you're saying about the IC and their engineering manager, of like, what is success, you know, if unless we kind of start to align on that sense of reality, then we, you know, the rest of it kind of, it's very difficult to make progress without that kind of foundation.
I'll share, you know, something that too, like, because Hazel asked, what's the rough balance between top down and bottom up? I think people might have big disagreements about this. Like, I see it as a big mix. Like, you know, but one thing I'll say from psychology is if you feel out of control, you know, in your life, like in things that really matter to you, you will try to find other ways to feel a sense of control and safety. And sometimes those strategies are damaging, but you're doing them because, you know, they work for you. Like they're doing something for you. So you might see an engineering org that's like, we love agile and we love autonomy and everybody's running off and doing their own thing. But, you know, actually there's bad communication between the teams. Like, is that a team that's really independent or not? You know, it's a big mess of things. And I think at the root of that often is that there's like too tightening of the top down. It's not courage to let people actually go bottom up in some places, you know, but then they're seizing the control in the place that they can get it.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a way in which there's a cultural, like a trans-historic phenomenon here, where initially developmental culture was much more autonomous and tight, small teams. Then it became scaled. And so, and then things became more fixed. So the like illusion of what software development is or could be kind of comes into rough collision with actually how it is currently. So yeah, that's great. I mean, I have so many questions and more I would like to ask, but
do a follow-up.
Yeah,
or the
it
top
is.
of the
We are out of time. Thank you guys so much for joining us. There will be the recording will go out. There may even be a podcast episode out of this as well.
Yeah, we're going to be putting it into our
yeah.
season. So I'll let you know, Giles, and you can
Yeah.
blast it